When we think of greatness, we often imagine it starting with privilege, wealth, education, connections. But the story of Abraham Lincoln begins in almost the opposite place. He was born in a one-room log cabin in the woods of Kentucky in 1809. His family had little money, and he had almost no access to formal schooling. By most standards of his time, he was not the child you would have bet on to one day lead a nation. And yet, in that very environment of lack, something critical was being shaped: resilience. You see, hardship has a way of either breaking us or building us. For Lincoln, it built him. He grew up doing farm labor, splitting rails, and working jobs that demanded strength and endurance. And while the physical labor was shaping his body, the isolation and quiet of rural life were shaping his mind. He developed a deep hunger to learn, borrowing books whenever he could, teaching himself law, reading by the dim light of a fireplace. That self-education didn't just give him knowledge. It gave him ownership of knowledge. Every page he turned was a page he earned. And that matters because when you fight for something, whether it's education, opportunity, or personal growth, you hold it differently. You don't take it for granted. What fascinates me is that Lincoln's beginnings were not merely humble in terms of material things. They were humble in spirit. He had no illusions of being destined for greatness. He was simply a young man who kept taking the next step available to him. There's a psychological depth here worth pausing on. Many of us stall in life because we believe the distance between where we are and where we want to be is too great. We say, I can't get there because I don't have the resources or the background or the connections. Lincoln could have said that 1,000 times. But instead, he took the smallest possible actions available to him. He practiced speaking, he paid attention to people. Small steps repeated consistently eventually compounded into remarkable strength. And this is where philosophy enters the picture. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, himself born a slave, once said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." Lincoln's life demonstrates this truth in living color. His circumstances were beyond his control. Poverty, loss of his mother at a young age, instability in his family. These were his givens. But what he could control was his response. Instead of collapsing under hardship, he used hardship as material for growth. His humility became the soil in which his character was rooted. There's also a psychological lesson here about identity. Lincoln didn't define himself by his environment. He could have looked at his cabin and said, "This is all I'll ever be." Instead, he built an inner identity that was larger than his circumstances. He chose to see himself as someone capable of more, someone who could rise. And what happens when you build that kind of inner identity? Your actions eventually rise to meet it. I think that's the takeaway for us. Too often, we look at our beginnings and decide they are the ceiling of our potential. We say, I wasn't born into privilege. I didn't have the best education. I've already been set back too many times. But if Lincoln teaches us anything, it's that your beginning does not determine your ending. What determines it is how fiercely you are willing to learn, how consistently you are willing to grow, and how deeply you are willing to believe that your current environment does not define your ultimate horizon. And let's be clear, humility is not weakness. Humility is the acknowledgement that greatness is not owed to you. It is built by you. Lincoln's beginnings taught him humility, and that humility became his strength. It allowed him to connect with ordinary people, to understand struggle, to empathize with the suffering of others. That empathy would later become one of his greatest assets as a leader. So when you look at Lincoln's log cabin childhood, don't see just a poor boy with little chance of success. See the laboratory of greatness. See the place where grit was formed, where self-discipline was born, where the hunger for knowledge took root. That was the foundation on which everything else was built. And here's the closing thought I want you to take with you. If Lincoln could rise from the dirt floor of a log cabin to the highest office in the land, then your beginnings, no matter how small, no matter how broken, cannot stop you from rising either. The question isn't where you started. The question is how far you're willing to go. If Lincoln's humble beginnings gave him resilience, then his repeated failures tested whether that resilience would hold. And to be honest, it almost didn't. When you look at his life, you don't see a straight line to success. You see setback after setback. He lost jobs. He failed in business. He was defeated in elections. He even suffered profound personal tragedies, including the death of people he deeply loved. By almost any measure, his life was filled with disappointment. Now, here's what's important. Most of us treat failure like a verdict. We think, I tried, it didn't work out, therefore I'm not good enough. And once that narrative sets in, failure becomes final. Not because it has to be, but because we decide it is. Lincoln faced this temptation many times. After losing an early run for state legislature, he could have quit politics altogether. After his business ventures collapsed, leaving him in debt for years, he could have resigned himself to a quieter, smaller life. And yet, he didn't. He kept stepping back into the arena, even when the arena had chewed him up before. This is where psychology sheds light on something profound. Failure itself doesn't destroy us. What destroys us is the meaning we attach to failure. If you see failure as evidence that you are inadequate, then every setback chips away at your sense of self. But if you see failure as information, as feedback about what didn't work, then it becomes part of the process, not the end of the process. Lincoln lived this distinction. He treated failure not as a verdict, but as a tutor. Every loss, every rejection, every disappointment, he let them instruct him. He let them refine him. Think about this. If he had won some of those early races, if success had come too quickly, he might not have developed the patience, the humility, or the depth that would later carry him through the Civil War. Those failures, painful as they were not detours. They were the preparation. And that is something worth remembering in our own lives. Sometimes the very setbacks that frustrate us are the shaping forces we will one day need. Philosophically, there's something almost paradoxical here. We think of failure as the opposite of greatness. But in Lincoln's case, failure was the raw material of greatness. Without those defeats, there would be no Lincoln as we remember him. The Stoics had a phrase for this, amor fati, a love of fate. The idea that whatever happens, even the hard things, can be embraced as necessary. Lincoln may not have used those words, but his life embodied the principle. He absorbed failure not with bitterness, but with a kind of quiet endurance that said, this too belongs to my story. What strikes me most about Lincoln's failures is how ordinary they were. Losing elections, struggling financially, battling self-doubt. These are experiences so many of us share. He was not spared the common struggles of life. And that is precisely what makes his story so relatable. He did not rise to greatness because he avoided failure. He rose because he refused to let failure define the limits of his life. And here's where it becomes practical for us. Failure is not going away. If you aim for anything worthwhile, you will face rejection, you will face disappointment, you will face moments where nothing seems to work. The choice is not between failing and not failing. The choice is between using failure and being used by it. If you let failure convince you that you are finished, it will shrink your world. But if you let failure inform you, shape you, and strengthen you, it will expand your capacity. Lincoln's story challenges us to rethink our relationship with failure. Instead of asking, how can I avoid it? A question no one can honestly answer. We should be asking, how can I endure it? How can I grow through it? How can I let it make me more? That is what Lincoln did over and over again until even his failures became part of his greatness. So the next time you face a setback, don't see it as the closing of a door. See it as part of the preparation, part of the necessary shaping of who you're becoming. Lincoln's life is proof that failure does not have to be the enemy of greatness. It can be the forge in which greatness is made. And here's the thought I'll leave you with: failure is not the end of your story unless you decide to stop writing. Keep writing. Keep stepping back into the arena. Because sometimes the very failures that make you want to quit are the ones preparing you to lead. If Lincoln's early failures revealed anything, it was that he was willing to keep moving forward long after most people would have quit. And this is where his story takes on a different dimension. It wasn't just that he failed and recovered. It was that he persisted relentless, stubbornly in the face of repeated disappointment. Persistence is often romanticized as if it's some heroic quality we summon in moments of clarity. But for Lincoln, it wasn't glamorous. It was gritty. It was quiet. It was a long string of small decisions not to give up, even when it would have been reasonable, maybe even easier, to do so. Persistence is rarely about big, dramatic gestures. More often, it's about the decision to show up again and again, despite the weight of discouragement. Lincoln understood this. After losing an election, he didn't let bitterness consume him. He prepared for the next one. When his law career moved slowly, he studied harder, spoke more, sharpened his skills. He didn't confuse temporary defeat with permanent inability. And that distinction is everything. Because once you start believing a setback is permanent, you're finished. He refused to give in to that kind of thinking. There's a psychological truth at work here. Human beings are wired to avoid pain, and failure is painful. So the natural instinct is retreat, to step back, to protect yourself from feeling it again. Persistence requires overriding that instinct. It requires seeing the long game, believing that the discomfort of today can be redeemed by the growth of tomorrow. That's what Lincoln did. He played the long game. And here's where the philosophical depth emerges. Aristotle described virtue as something cultivated through habit, not a single act. Persistence is exactly that, a habit of refusing to stop. You don't become persistent in one moment of inspiration. You become persistent by practicing it over time until it becomes second nature. Lincoln's life demonstrates this. He trained himself to keep going, even when the evidence around him gave him no guarantee of eventual success. But let's be honest. Persistence is not just about optimism. It's not about pretending things are easier than they are. Lincoln was deeply aware of struggle. He battled bouts of depression throughout his life. He knew darkness. And yet, his persistence was not rooted in denial. It was rooted in resolve. He didn't tell himself, "This is fine." He told himself, "This is hard, but I can endure it." That subtle difference matters because persistence built on denial collapses when reality hits. But persistence built on resolve grows stronger with every trial. This is why Lincoln became such a formidable leader later in life. By the time he faced the national crisis of the Civil War, he had already trained himself to persist through countless personal crises. He had already learned that you don't abandon the mission because it becomes painful. You endure the pain because the mission matters more. His persistence wasn't theoretical. It was practiced. It was lived. And that brings us to how this applies to us. Too often, people give up just one step before the breakthrough. They endure failure, but not long enough to transform it into growth. Persistence is the bridge between failure and greatness. Without it, failure stays failure. With it, but failure becomes foundation. The question isn't whether you will fail. It's whether you will persist long enough for that failure to turn into something useful. There's a simple image I want you to carry with you. Think of water dripping on a rock. One drop doesn't shape the stone. 10 drops don't. But over time, persistence carves through what looks unbreakable. That's Lincoln's life. He was not the most privileged. He was not the most connected. What set him apart was not luck. It was endurance. He kept dripping on the rock long enough for the stone to finally give way. So what do we take from this? That persistence isn't just about surviving hardship. It's about committing to the process long enough to see what hardship can make of you. It's about being willing to do the unglamorous work, to keep stepping forward, even when your legs feel heavy. Lincoln shows us that greatness doesn't come from avoiding pain or from one moment of triumph. It comes from showing up again and again and again until the story changes. And here's the closing thought: failure can stop you, but only if you let it. Persistence is the refusal to let failure have the last word. And if you can persist, if you can keep moving even when it hurts, then your story, like Lincoln's, can rise from struggle into greatness. When we look at Lincoln's persistence, it's tempting to think his success was purely about endurance, just holding on longer than others. But endurance by itself is not enough. Persistence without principle can be dangerous. What gave Lincoln's persistence its power was that it was tied to something deeper, a moral vision. He was not simply climbing for the sake of climbing. He was not chasing recognition for its own sake. His persistence was anchored in a clear sense of right and wrong, a conviction that truth and integrity were non-negotiable. And this is where Lincoln becomes more than just an example of grit. He becomes an example of character. He was known as Honest AB, not because the nickname sounded nice, but because people trusted him. They believed his word meant something. They believed his actions would align with his values in a time when politics was filled with manipulation and corruption. And let's be honest, it still is. Lincoln's integrity set him apart. Now, integrity isn't glamorous. It often costs more than it gives. For Lincoln, telling the truth sometimes meant losing supporters. Standing by his principles sometimes meant delaying progress or risking his career. But he understood something that many people miss. Shortcuts might get you ahead for a moment, but they undermine the foundation you're standing on. And if the foundation crumbles, the rise doesn't matter. Lincoln's integrity gave him a foundation that no setback could fully erase. Psychologically, this is fascinating. Human beings have a natural pull towards self-preservation. We want to avoid loss, avoid pain, avoid conflict. Integrity often asks us to choose the opposite, to tell the truth, even when lying would protect us, to stand firm, even when compromise would be easier. And this is why integrity requires courage. Not the courage of the battlefield, but the courage of the everyday, choosing to align your actions with your principles when no one else would fault you for bending. Lincoln embodied that courage. His moral vision was not abstract. It was centered on people, the dignity of every human being, the belief that justice mattered more than convenience. That vision guided his decisions, even when they carried enormous cost. He didn't chase popularity. He chased what he believed was right, and history remembers him for that, because leaders who live by popularity vanish when the popularity fades. But leaders who live by principle endure long after they're gone. Philosophically, this is the distinction between living for expediency and living for truth. Expediency asks, what works right now? Truth asks, what is right, even if it costs me? Expediency builds comfort. Truth builds character. Lincoln chose truth. That choice did not make his life easier, it made it harder. But it gave his leadership a weight, a gravity that could not be manufactured by charisma or strategy alone. This matters for us because the temptation of expediency is everywhere. In our careers, in our relationships, in our daily decisions, we face the choice between doing what is easy and doing what is right. Integrity asks us to take the harder road, not because it pays more in the short term, but because it shapes who we are in the long term. Lincoln's life reminds us that greatness is not measured just by achievements, but by the character behind those achievements. And here's the practical truth. People can sense integrity, just as they could sense it in Lincoln. People can sense it in you. Integrity builds trust, and trust is the currency of influence. Without it, you may gather attention, but you will not hold it. With it, you may face resistance in the moment, but you will leave an impact that endures. Lincoln's story shows us that greatness is not just about rising from failure. It's about rising with principle. It's about holding to a moral vision that outlasts the temporary storms of criticism or defeat. That is what made him more than just a politician. That is what made him a leader. And here's the closing thought I want you to carry: success without integrity is hollow, but integrity without success still carries weight. Choose to be remembered not for how quickly you rose, but for how deeply you stood. Because in the end, it is your vision and your integrity that define the true measure of your greatness. Persistence and integrity gave Lincoln strength, but the true test of both came when he stepped into leadership during the most divided and dangerous moment in America's history. It's one thing to endure personal setbacks. It's another to carry the weight of a fractured nation on your shoulders. The Civil War was not just a political conflict. It was a tearing apart of the national identity. Families were divided, communities split, and the future of the Union hung in the balance. In that kind of adversity, leadership is either exposed as shallow or revealed as genuine. For Lincoln, it was revealed. Adversity is the furnace where real leadership is forged. When the storms are calm, almost anyone can look like a capable leader. But when everything around you is falling apart, when people are losing hope, when the cost of every decision feels unbearable, that's when leadership shows itself for what it really is. Lincoln led not because he had every answer, not because he was free from doubt, but because he had the courage to move forward anyway. He carried the weight of uncertainty without collapsing under it. Psychologically, there is something powerful here. Leaders in adversity often experience what we might call decision fatigue. Every choice is scrutinized, every misstep amplified, and every outcome carries consequences that cannot be reversed. The temptation is to either freeze or to lead from fear. Lincoln resisted both. He was deliberate, but he was not paralyzed. He listened to counsel, but he did not let the loudest voices dictate his direction. His leadership was marked by balance, strength without arrogance, humility without weakness. And here's the remarkable thing. His leadership was not built on control, but on empathy. He carried an extraordinary capacity to understand the suffering of others, even those who disagreed with him. He visited soldiers, wrote letters to grieving families, and spoke with compassion to those who criticized him. In the middle of the bloodiest conflict in American history, he never lost sight of the humanity at stake. That empathy gave him credibility. People may not have agreed with him, but they could sense he cared. Philosophically, this takes us to the essence of leadership itself. Leadership is not about being the loudest voice in the room or wielding the most power. Leadership is about creating a vision people can believe in and embodying the strength they need when they no longer believe in themselves. In the midst of war, Lincoln became a steady anchor, not because he denied the chaos, but because he acknowledged it and still stood firm. There's a lesson here for every one of us. Adversity is not limited to nations at war. We face adversity in our homes, in our workplaces, in our communities. And in those moments, people are looking for leadership, not titles, not positions, but leadership. They are looking for someone who will stay calm in the storm, someone who will act with clarity when the path is uncertain, someone whose integrity can be trusted when everything else feels unstable. Leadership in adversity isn't about controlling people. It's about guiding them through fear toward hope. Lincoln's presidency shows us that leadership is not proven in the absence of crisis, but in the presence of it. It's easy to look steady when life is steady. But when life is unraveling, your steadiness becomes a gift to everyone around you. That's what Lincoln gave to America: a steady hand, a moral compass, and a willingness to endure hardship alongside the people he served. And here's the practical truth. You don't have to be president to lead this way. Every one of us faces moments when others are watching how we respond. When your family hits a difficult season, when your team at work feels uncertain, when your friends are in conflict, how you lead in that adversity sets the tone. You don't need perfect answers. You need presence. You need steadiness. You need to embody the same courage you hope to inspire in others. Lincoln's life reminds us that adversity doesn't disqualify you from leading. It qualifies you. It gives you the chance to rise above circumstances and to show others what resilience looks like in practice. It gives you the chance to prove that leadership isn't about power. It's about service. So when you encounter adversity, and you will, don't see it as an obstacle to leadership. See it as the opportunity to lead at the deepest level, because it is in the hardest times that people are most hungry for hope. And here's the closing thought. True leadership is not measured by how you act when the skies are clear, but by how you steady others when the storm is at its fiercest. If you can lead in adversity, then, like Lincoln, you can turn even the darkest hour into the beginning of greatness. When Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, the nation grieved not just the loss of a president, but the loss of a man whose story had become a mirror of America's own struggle. He had risen from obscurity, endured countless failures, persisted against all odds, and led with integrity in the darkest hour. And yet, what remains most powerful about his story is not merely what he accomplished, but the legacy he left behind, the way his life continues to inspire generations who never knew him personally. Legacy is a fascinating thing. It's not just the sum of what you do, it's the impression of who you were. Achievements fade with time, monuments crumble, words get misquoted, but the essence of a person's life, the values they embodied, that endures. Lincoln's legacy endures not simply because he was president, but because his journey speaks to something deeply human. It reminds us that greatness is not reserved for the privileged few. It is accessible to anyone willing to rise after falling, to persist after failing, to lead with moral clarity when the world feels lost. Psychologically, Lincoln's legacy works because it creates identification. We see ourselves in his struggles. We see our own disappointments mirrored in his defeats, our own doubts echoed in his self-doubt. And if he could rise from that, it whispers to us that maybe we can too. That's the power of a legacy built not on perfection, but on perseverance. A perfect hero feels distant, unreachable. But a flawed hero who rises, that feels possible. Lincoln gives us permission to believe that our scars do not disqualify us, they prepare us. Philosophically, his legacy raises the question of how we measure a life. Do we measure it by comfort, by accumulation, by the absence of struggle? Or do we measure it by the degree to which it lifts others, by the example it leaves, by the inspiration it provides long after we are gone? Lincoln's life suggests the latter. His greatness was not in living an easy life, but in living a meaningful one. One that continues to call others higher. And here's the part that's easy to overlook. Lincoln did not set out to build a legacy. He set out to do what was right in front of him. He set out to grow, to serve, to lead with principle. The legacy was a byproduct of those daily choices. That's important for us because sometimes the idea of legacy feels overwhelming, as if we need to plan some grand design for how we'll be remembered. But Lincoln shows us that legacy is not planned, it's lived. It's the accumulation of small, consistent acts of courage, honesty, and persistence. One day, those acts add up into something much larger than yourself. This is why Lincoln's story continues to resonate across cultures and centuries. He reminds us that no failure has to be final, that no beginning is too humble, and that no adversity is too great to overcome. His life is a living argument that hope can rise out of despair, that integrity can triumph over expediency, and that leadership rooted in service can outlast the storms of history. But here's the challenge: it's not enough to admire his legacy. The real question is, what will we do with it? Inspiration without action fades. It's like light shining on the ground, but never being picked up to guide your steps. The invitation of Lincoln's story is not to simply marvel at his resilience, but to ask yourself how you can apply the same principles in your own life. Where can you persist when it would be easier to quit? Where can you choose integrity over convenience? Where can you lead in adversity, even if it's just in your home, your workplace, or your community? Because in the end, the greatest way to honor Lincoln's legacy is not by quoting his speeches or admiring his portraits. It's by living in such a way that your own life becomes a legacy too. A legacy of resilience, of persistence, of integrity, of leadership in adversity. A legacy that whispers to others, if I could rise, so can you. And here's the final thought I want to leave you with. Lincoln's story is proof that greatness is not about where you start, but about how you live. And if his life teaches us anything, it's this: your failures do not have to be the end of your story. They can be the very beginning of your greatness.